the European Union in many ways developed its foreign and security policy through the lens of the wars in Yugoslavia. In the 1990s, this was the first big war in Europe after the end of World War II, were the wars in Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia dissolved at the time when the European Union was thinking of building more effective, better institutions, including the Maastricht Treaty, which was a landmark in the early 90s for building a more political European Union. And it was really at that moment when the European Union thought that it could resolve the problems in Yugoslavia by itself. This was a unique geopolitical moment. This was a moment when the Soviet Union had not yet disintegrated, but where Yugoslavia was in crisis and where for the European Union dealing with Yugoslavia was a test for European security. And also where the United States was less interested because the United States in 1991 was concerned with the first Gulf War, which was evicting Iraqi occupation of Kuwait, as well as ensuring that the Soviet Union would not dissolve violently. And so we had a moment when the Luxembourgish foreign minister in June 1991, who was the president of the EU presidency, this was the institution back then, announced that this was the hour of Europe to end the Yugoslav wars. Now, history tells us a different story. It was actually a failure of the European Union. While Slovenia could become independent without much war and fighting, Croatia was quickly embroiled in a very serious war with 1/3 of its territory occupied by Serbian-controlled Yugoslav army forces. And then afterwards, the war went on to Bosnia, which included the displacement of 2 million people, half of the population, and the death of over 100,000 people in the war between 1992 and 1995. None of which the European Union was able to prevent or even to resolve. So the war in Bosnia ended with American intervention at Dayton in Ohio. So even in Bosnia, everybody knows the word Dayton, which nobody would know about otherwise. And it's only because it's an American Air Force base. And the reason it was done at an American Air Force base was obvious. The American negotiator, Richard Holbrooke, explained in his memoirs how this was chosen to also underline American power, American military power. So what became very clear in the mid-1990s is that the European Union's ability to provide for peace in the Balkans failed because of Europe's inability to have the security dimension, the military force, to underline, to emphasize its diplomatic efforts. And this became again apparent in the 1999 conflict. In 1999, the US, together with NATO, decided to intervene in Kosovo when Serbia engaged in a campaign of ethnic cleansing and violence against Albanians in that particular part of the country. And NATO intervened notoriously without UN Security Council authorization because Russia and China vetoed any intervention. But again, it showed that EU was not able to deal with this security issue in Europe, but it was NATO and, importantly, the United States standing behind NATO with its resources to deal with the security concern. So the 1990s ended, the wars of Yugoslavia ended with the 1990s, but it became very clear that the European Union was not able to have a successful intervention because of the lack of its security tools. It lacked an army, it lacked a clear decision making process, and it lacked a unified foreign policy. Now, all of this generated and helped to trigger more thinking on the European Union about a common foreign and security policy. And you see what emerged in the 2000s through the Lisbon Treaty later was in many ways a product of the experience of the 1990s, of the wars of the 1990s in Yugoslavia. So having an external action service, having a main person in charge of foreign and security policy, who is, currently Borrell, a former Spanish foreign minister. All of this is a product, in a certain way, of EU's learning process from the wars in Yugoslavia in the 1990s. The strategy, the security strategy in the 2000s, has been twofold for the Western Balkans. On one side, integrating as many countries into NATO. So we've seen that NATO membership in the Western Balkans led to eventually the membership of Croatia, Albania, followed by North Macedonia and Montenegro, which means that Slovenia had joined earlier, that by today, all of the countries of the Western Balkans, except for Serbia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and Kosovo, are members of NATO. And the second pillar has been the expansion of the European Union. So 21 years ago, the EU offered membership to the countries of the Western Balkans, and it was very clearly communicated as being a process which was not just about EU membership, but it was also about stability and about securing peace in the region. The process was called the Stabilization and Association Process. Already the word stability is in there. And it was all about security in the Western Balkans, because it was very clear that only EU membership could provide for long-term political and security in the Western Balkans. Now, while NATO membership proceeded somewhat with some success, EU membership has not. So the only country of the Western Balkans which has joined since 2003, when that promise was made, was Croatia. Croatia joined in 2013 and has been a member now for over a decade, rather successfully, you could say. But none of the other countries of the Western Balkans, and so we have 6 countries left, as you probably know. We have Bosnia-Herzegovina, Serbia, Montenegro, Kosovo, North Macedonia, and Albania as countries which are not in the European Union in the Western Balkans. None of them is close to joining the European Union. The closest potentially is Montenegro, but none of the others are. So we have this process which has been stagnating, has been not moving forward. And I think this is important to understand also from a Ukrainian perspective of why this has been so difficult. Now, I'd say there are different reasons, but some of them, if we're focusing on the security side, the security challenges in the region have not been fully resolved. So this allows me to move to the kind of contemporary perspective on matters. And the contemporary perspective are, so what are the issues, the security concerns in the region? I would say the first big security concern is unresolved bilateral issues. Now, bilateral issues are issues between countries of the Western Balkans and both other countries in the Western Balkans, as well as countries in the European Union. There are different types of bilateral issues. Some of them are very minor. There are a few very minor border disputes because the borders in Yugoslavia were not defined in the detail in which international borders have been. So this has been a concern between countries. Not a big one because we're talking about very small areas of land, a few thousand square meters here and there, the river, the borders of rivers, but this has not been resolved between Serbia and Croatia, between Serbia and Bosnia-Herzegovina, etc. These are, let's say, the easiest and not a big security threat. We have then minority issues, issues of mutual minorities. So we have, for example, we have a Croatian minority in Serbia, or we have a Hungarian minority in Serbia. We have a Romanian minority in Serbia. We have an Albanian minority in North Macedonia, or a Greek minority in Albania. So basically, we have lots of minorities, both between countries of the Western Balkans as well as between the neighboring countries and the Western Balkans. This is not a problem as such, but has been sometimes become a problem. So we have sometimes had issues where countries have been worrying about their treatment of their minority in neighboring countries. Again, these have not been major issues. But then we have bilateral issues which are on identity questions. And they have been very difficult sometimes between EU member states and countries of the Western Balkans. Why? Because if you are an EU member, and unfortunately we also saw this with Ukraine and Hungary's attempt by Viktor Orban to make it difficult to start open accession talks with Ukraine end of last year, one member state can block the whole process. And we've seen this in the Western Balkans, where Greece has blocked North Macedonia for many years over the name. Greece claimed that the name Macedonia is exclusively Greek and that the state of Macedonia at the time should not be able to use the name. This was resolved in a Prespa agreement, an international agreement between the two countries, where North Macedonia changed its name into the Republic of North Macedonia. So it added the North to clarify that it's not claiming the territory of all of the historical region of Macedonia. So this is one bilateral issue, which has been explosive. It's been, again now, it's been Bulgaria, which has blocked Macedonia, with arguments which are very problematic. It's been arguing that North Macedonia should write the Bulgarian minority in the constitution, and it has denied that Macedonian is its own language and has its own history. Again, it shows you, because one EU member state has a lot of power, that it uses it against a country in the Western Balkans. So that's another type of bilateral issues, which is not per se directly a security concern, but it can become one because it can destabilize countries and it can discredit the European Union. And then finally, there are the most serious bilateral issues, and they would say are open territorial and political disputes between countries in the Western Balkans. And most of all, I'm thinking of the relationship between Serbia and Kosovo. This is probably the biggest security concern we have at the moment. And in fact, there was just a release of an American intelligence assessment for the Western Balkans, which says that there is a risk of isolated violence this year in Kosovo. And so here we have probably the most serious security risk. And the risk comes from the fact that Serbia never recognized independence of Kosovo. Kosovo declared its independence in 2008, but Serbia has not recognized it, and neither have 5 EU member states, Romania, Slovakia, Greece, Cyprus, and Spain, as well as other countries around the world, including Ukraine. And the issue is that Serbia denies the existence of Kosovo as an independent state, but there has been a negotiation process since 2011, mediated by the European Union, between Serbia and Kosovo, to try to what is called normalize relations, which tries to create normal, good neighborly relations. What that exactly means is never defined, because otherwise Serbia would have not participated. If the goal would have been officially to recognize Kosovo's independence, this would have not happened. But this has been a dialogue, and kind of, some people joke, a never-ending dialogue without clear results about the relation between the two. So by the way, if you have any questions, I saw there's just something in the chat, but I don't know if that's a question for me right now. Is that a...
This is not a question. This is like a short details for our students according to the technical moment.
Okay.
So
no.
If they will have some question or questions, I will tell you. It's not.
Okay, good. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you that you could help me monitor that. I can read a little bit of Ukrainian, but not good enough to at the same time talk and understand the details. So basically between Serbia and Kosovo, there is a very strong position on the Serbian government side to deny the existence of Kosovo. It's written in the constitution that Kosovo is a part of Serbia. And we've also seen a very systematic campaign by Serbia denying the statehood to Kosovo. So it's not just that it's de jure rejecting Kosovo's independence, but it's trying to undermine membership of Kosovo in international organizations, and it's also been generally kind of trying to attack the elected governments in Kosovo, really trying to kind of deny any attempt to be internationally recognized. Now, the international recognition is less of a security concern than the domestic dynamics. Kosovo has around 5% Serb minority, which lives both in the north in areas directly bordering Serbia, as well as in central Kosovo, where it is not directly connected to Serbia. But in the north, these areas are really, I would say, in a gray zone. They're not fully controlled by Kosovo, and they're not fully controlled by Serbia, and they've been used by Serbia to create instability in Kosovo. And many of the Serbs there don't really want to be living in Kosovo, or they've been encouraged by Serbia to reject Kosovo as a state. And the result has been often tensions between Kosovo and Serbia in the north. And they have sometimes led to violence. So last year, we've had two very important incidents of violence. The first one happened during demonstrations when new mayors were elected in the north, but they happened to be Albanian because nearly all Serbs boycotted the elections. So the only ones who went to the elections were Albanians, and as a result, the mayors were Albanian, but in areas where over 90% of the population are Serbs. So there were protests against them, but some of them became very violent against police officers and against the international peacekeepers, which are still there. And then also, more seriously, last September was an armed incident in North Kosovo where a paramilitary group of Serbs clashed with the Kosovo police, and there were several dead and injured, and it was unclear who actually was responsible exactly. But one of the instigators and leaders was a leading Serb politician from the north, closely linked to the Serbian government. So you can see there's a real risk of violence in Kosovo, also linked with organized crime, because the very fact that this territory is under control of neither Serbia nor Kosovo entirely gives a lot of gray zones for organized crime. It's, I think, a lot what we've seen in places like Transnistria, in Moldova, similar kind of dynamics. So we have this security concern in Kosovo, which remains probably the most dangerous region in the Western Balkans. Now, one element which, as you might remember, I've mentioned earlier, the countries which are not in NATO are Kosovo, Serbia, and Bosnia-Herzegovina. But what protects some level of peace in Kosovo is the presence of a NATO-led peacekeeping force, KFOR, which has been there since 1999, and whose task it is to secure the peace agreement, or rather the ceasefire agreement from that time, which means that there is not a very large NATO presence, but it certainly is a deterrent, and Serbia, by the agreement, is not allowed to re-enter Kosovo. So if Serbian security forces would officially re-enter Kosovo, there would be a mandate from the UN Security Council for this NATO-led troops to intervene. And this has been helping to prevent violence, further violence. So the violence we've seen is often between groups which are not official state actors, but these informal groups, which can be violent, but which have limits of what they can do. The second major security issue, and I've talked about the bilateral issues very much, are internal security threats. And I would say the main one here in the region is in Bosnia-Herzegovina. Bosnia-Herzegovina as a state was in a certain way re-established after the war of 1995 as a very weak federal state, which is so complicated that I would need many hours to explain to you how it works, but in fact it just doesn't work. But the point is, it's a deeply divided society, and it's a state which has these two very autonomous political entities, and the smaller of the two, is Republika Srpska, which has an overwhelming Serb majority, and the political leader of the Serb Republic, as one could translate it, has been talking, it has been in power now for nearly 20 years, and has been talking about seceding from Bosnia-Herzegovina. So he's been promoting secession from the country. Now, if you look at a map of Bosnia-Herzegovina, this entity has a very odd shape, and it's actually cut in half in one point. It couldn't just leave Bosnia-Herzegovina. It has no right to secede, but this threat has been destabilizing Bosnia-Herzegovina, and it's also meant that he has been blocking a lot of decisions in the country. And again, a very decentralized, very federal country. It's called a, you call the system like a power sharing system, similar to what you have in other places like Northern Ireland or Belgium, is making it very difficult for decisions to be taken. So Bosnia has been not able to move towards the European Union, has been a very fragile state as a result, and has been thus, in a certain way, becoming less stable over the last 2 decades. And the European Union has not been able to find a good answer, because it's not about bilateral relations like Serbia and Kosovo, but it's been a lot about the internal relations and the fact that nationalist radical parties tend to win elections and polarize against one another. And this has been a major security concern in Bosnia-Herzegovina. So these are, in a certain way, the internal issues. Now, I would say there's also an external dimension. There are external actors which have become more active in the Western Balkans. So besides Russia, there's been China and Turkey, which have become quite active in multiple levels in the Western Balkans. Now, I would say they don't all have the same policy, and they act in different ways. Russia has been mostly trying to spoil NATO and the European Union. It has not the same resources and power it has as it has used in Georgia, or of course not to mention its aggression against Ukraine, because of course the Western Balkans are surrounded by NATO, so you can't fly a plane to Serbia unless you cross NATO territory, and so this has made Russian involvement more difficult, but it's been supporting basically pro-Russian politicians and pro-Russian ideas in the Western Balkans, primarily in Serbia and among Serb politicians in the neighboring countries. It's tried to stop NATO membership of countries, in particular Montenegro and North Macedonia. So it's been a disruptor. It's been promoting anti-Western ideas, which have been promoted also by the Serbian President Vučić, who, as you might know, is also the only government in Europe outside of Belarus not supporting the sanctions against Russia due to its aggression. You can still fly from many Russian cities to Belgrade every day. So this shows you how Serbia has been willing to maintain good relations with Russia. I would argue this is not because of Russian influence, but because Serbia sees it as its own interest to do so. We can talk about why this is the case. And then we've had also the involvement of China in the region. China has been also very active, in particular in Serbia, buying up industry, building infrastructure, not just in Serbia, but also in Montenegro, in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and North Macedonia. So investments, loans, all of which create political dependencies. China's position is much less clearer than Russia's. It is not clear whether China is against NATO, against EU membership of the countries. In fact, one might argue it's in favor of EU membership because it buys it influence in the European Union. So to some degree, China would like to have partners, countries it has a strong influence over, who are in the EU and thus have more influence as a result. Hungary is a good example. And so we see that these countries have been using the Western Balkans as an area which is not as much integrated into the European Union and has become more, they could get more influence there more easily than in the European Union. So they're not having the same agenda, but all of them are, I would argue, potentially destabilizing, because they often either directly, like Russia, try to pursue anti-Western policies, or by the way they are active in the region, undermine democracy and rule of law. So they, many of the investments by China, also by Turkey and by the United Arab Emirates, are state secrets. They're often intransparent, and they often mean that people don't know who pays what to whom, which can lead to abuse of resources, of money. And that, of course, helps more autocratic leaders than democratic leaders. So we see that we have a kind of an undermining of democracy by these external actors. So if I would put the picture together, I would say we have a situation where the Western Balkans are surrounded and integrated into NATO and surrounded by the European Union. So in a larger security perspective, there's not much which can happen without the very much involvement of the European Union and NATO. But they have not been fully integrated. So 3 members are not in the NATO and 6 are not in the European Union. This has been a source of instability and has been used by external actors as well as domestic actors. There's been sporadic incidents of violence. Nobody, I think, anticipates a new war in the Western Balkans in the way in which we saw the war in the 1990s. But there is a level of instability which is serious, and which also provides a security challenge for the European Union and for NATO. Now, of course, this is incomparable to the security challenge which has been posed by Russian aggression against Ukraine. There's absolutely no doubt about it. But it's been, in a certain way, sometimes a distraction, and it's another area in Europe where there is a level of instability and security concerns which the EU has not been able to resolve. We see, as I started with, that the Yugoslav wars happened at the same time as Europe developed its own foreign and security policy instruments. But as you know, and as we see, these are still not fully functional. They are still not perfect. And still, for security concerns, Europe relies a lot on NATO. Now, of course, this is both a good thing and a bad thing. It is a good thing because NATO has experience and a long record of security, but of course it also relies still very strongly on the United States. And as we can see now, with the risk of a second Trump presidency in the United States, this security umbrella of NATO becomes more challenging, more difficult, because it relies very strongly on the American military backing, which cannot be taken for granted in Europe. It cannot be taken as a certainty. And so the security weaknesses of Europe remain in place because European countries have overall, with many exceptions, not been willing to invest in security in the way and build a common security structure in a way which prevents these crises to reoccur. So in many ways, we are in a moment this year and next year where the European and transatlantic security structure will be tested. Hopefully it will survive. Hopefully we will not have a second Trump presidency. But again, one cannot live of hope alone. So in a certain way, the peace in the Western Balkans, the relative peace we've had over the last 20 years, also depends on both the future of the region in the European Union and the transatlantic alliance, as well as the commitment of the transatlantic alliance and the EU to the peace order which was established after the wars of the 1990s. This was always a very clear message. There are many actors in the region who would like to revise the borders, who are willing to use force. The only reason they're not doing it is because they see that the cost of doing it would be too high, because there would be a response from NATO and the European Union. But all of that depends on the predictability that, in fact, NATO and the EU would protect the peace and the current territorial arrangement in the Western Balkans. So in a certain way, security in the Western Balkans depends to a large extent on the wider stability of the European and transatlantic security architecture. If that one is under threat, also peace and stability in the Western Balkans would come under serious pressure. So this would be my kind of very brief kind of overview over how I see the situation in the region. And I'm very much looking forward to any questions you might have.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Bieber, for your expertise. It's very valuable for us in the context of understanding of European security policy according to the Western Balkan stories. So if we will have, we have a lot of time for discussion, and if someone has any question, please feel free to ask. Yes, please. Hikmatullah, please take your floor.
Thank you for the lecture. Do you agree with the opinions that the problem in the Kosovo also lies in the fact that in many European countries, in many countries of the world, there are ethnic groups that also want independence, that also has separatism in their minds? What do you think?
Thank you. I mean, I think if you look at the countries which have not recognized Kosovo in the European Union, you can see that these are countries which are not doing it because of Serbia, but because they worry about their own minorities. So, you know, Spain because of Catalonia, Cyprus because of North Cyprus, Slovakia and Romania because of the Hungarian minority, and well, Greece is the only exception, and they didn't recognize Kosovo because of Cyprus, solidarity with Cyprus. So you're absolutely right that this is the main reason. And of course, the problem of Kosovo's independence was that unlike the republics of Yugoslavia, in 1991 there was an EU lawyers committee called the Badinter Committee, named after the French judge and lawyer who passed away just a few weeks ago, Robert Badinter, which said Yugoslavia is in the process of dissolution. So basically, Yugoslavia was not working as a country anymore. And this implication was that all of the republics have a right to independence, but not the provinces. And Kosovo was a province. And so in this interpretation of international law and the practice afterwards, there was always a distinction made between the republics and the provinces. And the provinces were Vojvodina and Kosovo, so they would not have a right to independence while the republics did. And this has made it very difficult after the war in 1999 to find a way which would recognize Kosovo's independence while not opening the door to these concerns which you have mentioned. Now, there was a case at actually the UN General Assembly at the request of Serbia asked the International Court of Justice to offer an advisory opinion on the declaration of independence of Kosovo. Now, the court was very careful, and it said that the declaration of independence is not breaking international law, but it had a very narrow interpretation of that because it only said it's a declaration. They didn't investigate the actual act of independence, just the declaration. Of course, we as a group here, we can declare independence, but it's meaningless because we're not a government or an authority or a parliament. But in the case of Kosovo, this was not a random group of people on Skype, but this was the Parliament of Kosovo, and it had consequences in practice. Now, you can look at the opinions back then provided by governments. The governments which support Kosovo's independence have always argued that Kosovo is a sui generis, a special case. It's not a precedent for other cases because the governments supporting Kosovo have said, well, Kosovo, first of all, has been under international administration. So this is different from Catalonia or different from other cases. So it's an international administration over Kosovo, which lasted from 1999 until 2008, and in some elements is still ongoing. Secondly, there were massive human rights violations committed by the government against the minority, against something which has not happened in Catalonia or in other places. And there was, the international mission was established by UN Security Council resolution, which also said that there should be a process to determine the future status of Kosovo. So while there was no international agreement on what that status should be, there was an agreement that the status needs to be addressed, which is not the case with minorities asking for self-determination or independence elsewhere. So the argument of governments supporting Kosovo's independence have argued that Kosovo is a special case, not a precedent. Now, we've had those who are against Kosovo's independence who said, well, this is actually a precedent. Well, we've seen even Russian President Vladimir Putin using Kosovo's independence to claim to justify the annexation of Crimea, for example, or of territories in Georgia, to claim that this is a precedent. I don't think it's a very plausible argument, but there are others who have a legitimate concern about this. So this is a debate, I would say, but the challenge, of course, in Kosovo is that it has been recognized by over 100 countries, and that de facto it has been independent for the last 25 years. And that while Serbia claims to have sovereignty over Kosovo, it does not exercise sovereignty, and there's no way it could integrate 2 million Albanians into the state which don't want to live in the state. So in a certain way, the pragmatic argument is more convincing, but it does, as I'm trying to show, there are these worries of countries which make Kosovo a very tricky case, much more difficult than all the other republics which became independent.
Yeah, thank you for answer. Ukraine also didn't recognize Kosovo because of problems in Crimea, in Donetsk, Luhansk republics, also because of Carpathian Rusyns. I hope I call it proper. I don't know how this name in English, but yes. Yeah, we have this problem.
Okay, thank you very much for your question, Hikmatullah, and for your answer, Professor Bieber. Any question? More? You just can raise your hand, and we will see that you have a question. Okay, I would like to take some time and ask my question, actually, for giving some time for our students to think about their questions. And actually, my question will be about some comparative analyze Balkans war and Ukrainian war, actually, because it's very widespread belief that Russian-Ukrainian war is something absolutely nonsense for European security, because this is the first war after the Second World War in the European region. But a lot of people say that it's not the true, because Balkans war was the first one. And actually, it's not the first example when in the middle of the European region, we have a huge military conflict. I would like to ask you, I know that the nature of those conflicts really different, but I would like to ask you about some similarities and differences between these two conflicts, and maybe some strong, not all, because really these conflicts are very different, but maybe some similarities and differences according to the European security policy in general. Thank you.
Thanks, Alina. I think, there, as you rightly say, quite some differences. I think the first one is that, and this makes a big difference, is that that the Russian aggression in Ukraine is a clear security threat for Europe, which the Balkan wars never were in the same way. I mean, it's clear that Serbia was the main aggressor, not the sole aggressor, but the main country government responsible for the wars in Yugoslavia, was never a security threat for an EU member or a non-Yugoslav state. It never threatened EU states. It never had the resources. It is a small country at the end of the day. So, and I think this is why, as you pointed out, many West Europeans especially, were saying that the Russian aggression against Ukraine was kind of the first war after 1945. And they ignored the Yugoslav wars. They also ignored, of course, often the beginning of the war in 2014 in Crimea and in Donetsk and Luhansk. They ignored the war in 2008 in Georgia. They ignored also the war between Armenia and Azerbaijan over Nagorno-Karabakh. Because none of these wars really threatened European security. These were all wars which were, in some ways important, in some ways, of course, wars, but they were not seen as a direct threat by others in Europe. The Yugoslav wars were more a shock because people thought that, the future of Europe is peaceful and united, not through war. So this was a surprise because people expected this not to happen. But this war was always fairly localized. So it was more a challenge for European security in its inability to stop the war. And of course, there were all these consequences, which we also had in the 90s, refugees, which came to the European Union, and the kind of all the larger challenges which come with any war in terms of security, crime, weapons proliferation, but it never threatened European security. And also, of course, the war was regional, also in the sense that back then, Russia was not an important international actor, and it did not support Serbia particularly, or China. So in that sense, there was no global dimension to this war. And at least in the first half of the 90s, the US and the EU were dominant powers. And so this is something which made it a very different kind of conflict than the war we have now, where this is seen as both the confrontation between Russia and the West, but also then a larger, issue of the future relations between the West and China, for example, with China not having been supporting Russia in this conflict. So it's seen as being part of a more global, new configuration of power, while in the 90s it was seen more as a local conflict which didn't fit into the new power relations which were dominated by the kind of American dominance in the world. So in that sense, I think the real security risk is much greater today, and also the perception of it as being a real security issue in Europe is much greater than it was back in the 90s.
Thank you very much for your answer. And one more question. We can see that some Balkans countries, they support somehow Russia in Russian-Ukrainian conflict. And actually, I would like to know your opinion about this fact. What the nature of this support? For example, we know that in Serbia there are a lot of people who just support the Russian side of this conflict. Maybe you can give the answer. What the point of this support? What the nature of this support?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, it's a bit of a paradox because, of course, if Serbia is claiming Kosovo and against the independence of Kosovo, it should support Ukraine's claim to territorial integrity as well. The logical principle would be for Serbia to support Ukraine rather than Russian aggression. And it's been struggling to justify this because, for example, Serbia did support UN Security Council, UN General Assembly resolutions, which were in favor of, or which criticized the threats to Ukrainian territorial integrity, because Serbia cannot not do that. But at the same time, it's been not imposing sanctions on Russia. It's been supporting Russia in many ways. And I think it's a lot to do with the fact that Russia is providing, well, I think let's say there are two parts. There's a domestic and there's an international part. The domestic part is that many Serbs have a pro-Russian opinion. And that's been also deliberately cultivated by Serbian media. They've been talking about the Serbian-Russian friendship, about close alliance between Serbia and Russia. Not that this is a historical fact, but this has been promoted as a story told in the last 10, 15 years. Now, of course, there are historical moments of cooperation between Russia and Serbia. For example, after the October Revolution, many white Russians, Russians, royalists, went to Belgrade, to Serbia, because there was a monarchy in Yugoslavia. So there were these kind of historical ties, and the Russian Empire supported Serbia at certain times in the 19th century. But again, this was not always simple as it is presented now. But so it's this kind of Serbian sympathy for Russia as a power. But then also the second one is that by supporting Russia, Serbia believes that it can get support for Russia for Kosovo. So basically it's an exchange to say, if you support us on Kosovo, in the UN Security Council, which matters in the UN, we will support you when it comes to Ukraine. But the Serbian government has been very careful, exactly as I mentioned, to both, not impose sanctions, but also condemn the threat to territorial integrity. Of course, that resolution does not mention Russia, it just mentions the threat to territorial integrity of Ukraine, as if, aliens are threatening it, not a country. But so they're trying to square the circle, because they also don't want to break all the bridges to the West. Much more money and investment and also prestige comes from the West. So it's a tricky balancing act, but it's a deliberate balancing act, which Serbian government is engaging in. There are other more pro-Russian actors in Serbia and in Bosnia, for example, who are outright pro-Russian and who say, we need to support Russia on everything. Serbia tries to, and it argues, for example, why it doesn't want to impose sanctions. It doesn't say because it supports Russia, but it says because we experienced sanctions in the 1990s, so we don't want to have sanctions against others. Of course, they're not mentioning that that the sanctions in the 90s against Serbia are very different sanctions than the sanctions against Russia today. But this is just used as an excuse. So they're not saying we're not having sanctions because Russia is great, but because, they're justified in a different way.
Yes, thank you very much for your answer. It's really very interesting that Serbia, for example, as a country which would like to be a member of European Union and try to play the game of two sides at the same moment. They try to be involved in the European community in one side, but on another one, they try to get some support for their internal political process from Russia. So yes, it's very interesting situation. Thank you for your opinion. It was very clear and understandable. Okay, I saw that Professor Ovchuk have the question. So yes.
Okay, yes. First of all, I'd like to say that I agree with Professor Bieber that supporting of Serbian people of Russia, first of all, has historical roots, and I agree with that. So, Professor Bieber, tell me please, what do you think about Russia manipulating due to Serbia, and what kind of this manipulated this country uses for this for Serbia and Serbian people? And we understand that this country, which today is aggression, they do it for spread their interests and for make some not very good acts due to European Union, especially when we talk about the big Russia-Ukrainian war. So what is Russia manipulates due to Serbia?
Well, I mean, I would say that in Serbia, this use or this pro-Russian positions in support of Russia is very much a domestic decision. So I would say it's not so much that Russia is manipulating Serbia. I mean, of course, Russia is using its leverage because of the UN Security Council, but at the same time, I don't see that Russia is in a certain way manipulating Serbia, but I'd rather the Serbian government is using Russia for its own domestic purposes and its own policies, because mostly it's about staying in power. It's an authoritarian government, and it tries to not break bridges with the West completely, but at the same time to have a certain distance. And it's been promoting pro-Russian narratives in the media for the last 10 years. But I would say this is not because Russia has been pressuring Serbia, but rather because the government wants to do it, because it wants to have a population which is more anti-Western, because it can control it better. It doesn't have the pressure to join the European Union. So in that sense, I think the Serbian government is using also the international kind of geopolitical tensions for its own advantage to get a maximum space of autonomy within the international system. And as long as it doesn't get too much pressure from each side, it's able to live with it. So in a certain way, we know that, for example, Serbia is selling munition to Ukraine while also having a pro-Russian position. Now, this seems like a complete paradox, but for Russia, it's better to have Serbia, which sells weapons to Ukraine, but at the same time supports Russia internationally and doesn't have sanctions, because that gives some benefits. For the West, it's more important that Serbia sells ammunition to Ukraine than that it has sanctions. So everybody can live with Serbia not taking sides. And as a result, the government has a lot of space. And I think this is really what we're talking about, is that it's trying to maneuver and use this for its own advantage. And then it's using these historical narratives, myths about Serbian Russian friendships and so on. But you could, in a certain way, I think it's an instrument, which of course, if you tell it a lot of times to the people start believing it. But also, and I talk to people now, we have around 150,000 Russians living in Serbia. Many of whom have left, all of them have basically left because of the war. Many Serbs, for the first time, meet Russians, which they have not, had any encounters, and now they realize that in fact they're maybe not that similar as they always thought they were. And many people have much more complicated experiences, because all of a sudden rents are going up and it's more difficult to survive because so many Russians are living in a not so big city and all of that. But this is of course a much more everyday life experience. But overall, I would say that this issue is something where we see Serbia using this supposed friendship with Russia for the regime is using it for its own purpose.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your question, Professor Ovchuk, and thank you for your answer, Professor Bieber. Some more questions from our students, please. Feel free to ask. Okay. Hikmatullah, please. Second question.
Professor Bieber, in your opinion, just as a human, did you think that Kosovo deserved an independence? What do you think about it? Like historically? Yeah.
Deserve is a very difficult category. I mean, I think that there was no alternative to independence for Kosovo in this particular circumstance. And I'm aware that in international law, this was a very tricky situation. But I think it's also, I mean, I've been traveling to Kosovo and Serbia and talking to people for 20 years, more than 20 years now, and what is very clear is that Serbia had basically a kind of military occupation of Kosovo in the 1990s, where Albanians were excluded from schools, from public administration, and it was a repressive government. And there was never a plan in Serbia of how actually Albanians could live in Serbia, in Kosovo as part of Serbia. And you have to keep in mind, we're talking about, the 2 million people, 2 million Albanians roughly in Kosovo, and roughly 7 million Serbs living outside of Kosovo. So we're talking about, a very important part of the population of Serbia if Serbia was with Kosovo, would be Albanians. Serbia never had a plan of how to make space. They wanted the territory, but not the people. And so there was never a proposal of Serbia of how Albanians could become a part of the state. And in fact, the only experience after the end of communism was a repressive regime, which then culminated in ethnic cleansing. So the issue here is that I don't think that another solution would have been viable. There was no attempts made to really offer any alternative to independence. Saying that Kosovo is part of Serbia does not really offer any. It's not a specific suggestion beyond saying it's a phrase. So I would say that the independence of Kosovo was the best solution in the circumstances. A tricky one, a difficult one in international law and considering the circumstances. I would say overall, it's also done relatively well since it's become independent with all the difficulties. So I would say that, I don't think deserve is always a tricky concept because I think people deserve things, countries I'm always more hesitant about that. There are certain rights and there are certain obligations and certain, restrictions. I think in the context of the time, it was the best possible solution. And I think I would say it was justified because of what happened before to grant Kosovo independence. And I think it was the only viable way to make this work. And I think to some degree, at some point, Serbia will have to come to terms with it, and it probably will, because again, it has no alternative to offer besides this phrase of, Kosovo is part of Serbia, but it doesn't know how it would actually manage such a large part of the population which does not want to live in the country. So I think from that point of view, it probably was the best solution.